Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of the Airfix 1/72nd scale D3A1 Val build video series. If you haven't seen part 1 where I assembled the kit, go check that out. In today's video we'll be focusing on giving it a little bit of paint. Picking up from where we left off, I decided to go with a green and a grey two-tone scheme based on some reference photos I found for an aircraft that was part of the Battle of the Coral Sea, but I also decided I would include the famous Japanese black anti-glare cowling on the front. Now, this was a scheme I'd attempted probably about 6 years ago when I was a lot younger with the Airfix Pearl Harbor 75th anniversary set. However, the colours included for that were pretty much identical with the B5N2 Kate as the Royal Air Force colours, but without flat earth. The aircraft I painted still survives to this day, however it's probably going to be subject to a restoration video at some point in the future. I decided though that those weren't the correct colours I wanted to go with. I wanted something that was a little bit more pale and lighter with the grey, and a little bit darker with the green. So I decided to experiment and try out first of all Vallejo 70907 Pale Grey and 70970 Deep Green. As you'll find out, in the end I wasn't really happy with the deep green and ended up changing it. However, I was pretty happy with the pale grey, which incidentally was the first colour I would apply since it was the lightest. I decided to also experiment by putting the paint directly from the bottle onto the aircraft and then spreading it out with a brush using a little bit of water to help thin it down in an attempt to help reduce how much paint I'd waste instead of putting it on a palette of some kind. However, I found that it made it harder to mix the paint and make it less gloopy in the areas where the paint had not been applied with the bottle, so later on I'd switch back to my usual technique. However, for spreading out the paint, I use a pretty similar technique that I've always done, which is to wet the brush a little bit to help thin the paint out, and then apply it as much as I possibly can in the direction of the airflow. Once I'd applied the first layer of the pale grey, I then applied a layer of 70970 deep green on the upper surface in pretty much an identical fashion. Every now and again I'll change the direction I am stroking to help spread out the paint if it's more convenient. However, once I've done that, I'll then go over it again in the same direction as air would flow over the aircraft. And the reason I harp on about this is because the more you do that, the less chance you'll have of brush strokes being visible. And as long as you keep the paint layers nice and thin, but also not too watered down, you'll end up with a nice and almost airbrush looking finish, even though you've used a brush to paint it. I also find that the Vallejo paints in particular help with this, since they're very nicely mixed straight out of the bottle and you don't really need much water to thin them down at all as compared to the Tamiya ones, which can be pretty inconsistent with how they are between different colours. And since I'm on the subject of Tamiya colours, I thought I'd also bring up that I recently did a Tamiya 1/72nd scale Mitsubishi Zero. Unfortunately I don't have a video coming for this one, but on this particular project I used XF12 Japanese Navy Grey all over. And I found that this paint in particular was really inconsistent and hard to get to the right ratio of paint to water, and I found every time I was applying a layer of paint it would strip the layer underneath, so it just didn't seem to be as good a quality as the Vallejo paints, which is why I shied away from using any Tamiya for the main colours on the Val. Eventually I finished applying the deep green and found at the very end of it that I was really not happy with the colour. It just seemed way too vibrant and almost cartoony, and it just didn't look like the correct shade of green when I'd seen reference photos of other Japanese aircraft. So I decided to spend a little bit of time looking at some other colours and doing some tests, and eventually I decided to try Vallejo 70.823 Luftwaffe Camouflage Green, which incidentally is supposed to be the equivalent to RLM 82, which is a very late war German green that was used on a lot of their ME262s and that sort of thing. So, a bit surprised with my choice, I decided to apply a layer and see how it went. Much again in the same fashion as I'd done the previous layers, and after that initial coat I decided I was happy with Luftwaffe Camouflage Green, so I applied 2 more coats of that and also 2 more coats of the pale grey blue on the underside of the aircraft. The only thing I changed up later is, as I mentioned, I started to put the paint on a little bit of paper as a palette, rather than applying it from the bottle directly onto the model to help make it easier to thin out the paint, so I could get some nice thin layers with a lot less of the paint marks, so it looked more airbrushed. Once I was happy with the base camouflage colours, I painted the cowling and also the tyres of the aircraft with some Vallejo flat black, again keeping the paint nice and thin when I was applying it and doing it in about 2 coats. After the black had been done, I then went along with a fine brush and a bit of the pale green and the RLM 82 to help neaten up any mistakes I made. The thin brush was also used to apply some Luftwaffe camouflage green onto the canopy. I decided I want to have the canopy open, especially since I wanted the rear gun out, and there was no way for the Val to really do this with the canopy closed. However, because of the way the Airfix kit is designed, you couldn't really have it open, so I decided to just leave the rear section of the canopy off and paint the middle section separately. I painted the identification band at the rear of the fuselage with some Vallejo flat white and the fine brush, before then painting the middle frame for the cockpit and also the red stripes that are on the fairings of the reference aircraft. The markings included in this kit are for an aircraft that would have been painted in the overall grey scheme that was present at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. However, I still needed a lot of the common markings, such as the red Japanese roundel, which I cut out from the stencil sheet and then applied in a little bit of clean water, and after the decals had come loose from the paper, I then slid them onto the aircraft using a brush, using a little bit of water to help move them around. I also included the engine details and the serial, as well as some of the markings that are on the propellers. When I was happy with the placement of the decals, I then applied some Vallejo decal softener over the top of them using a cotton tip, and over the top of that some Tamiya decal adhesive. Since the aircraft had a lot of raised rivets and details, it was really important for the decals to both adhere and also conform to the surface detail, and both of these products help them do that. I then went over the canopies with a sharpened cocktail stick, since the paint had now dried but was not fully hardened, so it was easy enough to scratch them away from the areas I did not want them. Once I'd done that, I then glued the rear machine gun into place very carefully using a little bit of rocket CA glue and a pair of tweezers, and then I painted some of the final markings on the tail using a bit of Vallejo vermilion red. And with that, the aircraft was finally ready for some weathering, which is what we will be covering in the next video on this series, so stay tuned for when that one comes out, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks again, and until the next video, model on!